Hello and welcome to episode 97 of the Chills at Will podcast. Man, I've been able to speak to some great writers, and it's a pleasure today to have Kyle Beachy on with me. A little bit about Kyle. His first novel, The Slide Through Dial Press 2009, won the Chicago Reader's Best Book by a Chicago author, Reader's Choice Award for the year. That's a heck of a mouthful right there.
Yeah.
His short fiction has appeared in journals including Fanzine, Pank. This dang font is too small. Sorry. Hobart.
Yeah, Pank. Rest in peace, Pank.
Oh no. No. Hobart, Juked, the Collagist, 5 chapters, and others. His writing on skateboarding has appeared in The Point, The American Reader, The Chicagoan, Free Skateboard Magazine in both the UK and Europe. I guess it was the same thing. The Skateboard Mag in the US, Jenkem, which is definitely something we want to talk about. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, sure.
Deadspin, rest in peace, kind of. And and the classical. Yeah. He teaches at Roosevelt University in Chicago and is a co-host on the skateboarding podcast Vent City with pro skater Ryan Lay and others. His newest book, we're going to talk a lot about today, is called The Most Fun Thing: Dispatches from a Skating Life, and it's been released in 2021 to rave reviews, which, you know, even since I've done the bio two or 3 days ago, he's gotten some more recognition and awards. So Kyle, welcome. Great talking to you beforehand. How are you today?
Man, I'm doing great, Peter. Thank you very much for having me here. This is exciting.
Well, I think we talk about some pretty existential things, but like, first of all, Craig Mack, Flavor in the Ear, like you're not a fan of the remix as much?
You know, man, I like that remix. I mean, I think Busta Rhymes' verse on the remix is probably worth the fact that the remix exists. Do you know? I mean, I don't know if this is apocryphal, but the story that I've got, I have a buddy who's a longtime hip hop DJ and producer, and he's one of these guys who's done it long enough that he's had a chance to like you work with a whole lot of legends. Sure. He worked with Grand Puba. He worked with MC8. He did a track with like across the board, like established guys. But anyway, the sort of potentially apocryphal factoid that I've heard about Craig Mack's Flavor in Your Ears is because of the way that Sean Puffy Combs licensed that song. Craig Mack got a grand total of $10,000 lifetime for making that like absolutely timeless anthem of East Coast rap from the 1990s, $10K. So my hope is that in these kind of remixes, he maybe the licensing works out and he gets paid more.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So this was based on one of your Twitter posts today. But yeah, I mean, just for the fact that Biggie says I get more butt than ashtrays, like I mean,
it's hard. It's hard to top that.
Yeah. Hard to top that.
Yeah.
Oh man. So I think we're about the same age. I think I'm born in 1980. It seemed like maybe got me by a year or two. So same generation.
Mm-hmm.
What were you into growing up? Is this is the Midwest? Is this St. Louis, suburban St. Louis? Because I know there's a difference.
Yeah. I grew up.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. And kind of cling to that. Like it's one of these things that people from St. Louis tend to hold on to it a little bit. A lot of us leave. But it does feel like this kind of diaspora, right? Like that St. Louisans are all over because we remain St. Louisans in this weird way. But yeah, I grew up there, and it's funny. I know that a big part of your podcast is asking people about their sort of like early books and their early inspirations in terms of literature, and like the challenge with me is at least threefold. And one of those folds is that like I was an outdoor kid. Like I wasn't a big reader. I was playing a lot of sports. I was running around the neighborhood. I was using my body. I was getting into trouble outside. And so I wasn't like a quiet sitting down with a book kid. Mm-hmm. The second fold is that I'm a very slow reader. Did you freeze? Did we freeze up here?
Can you hear me? You got me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Let me move. Is this you can hear me now?
Yeah, your video is just frozen is all. Maybe that's all that's going on.
I'm moving. I'm moving to a better spot. Give me 1 sec.
Okay. I have no problem starting that one over. That's fine.
No, go for it. Sorry about that. So you're saying you're talking about being an outdoor kid.
Yeah, so I was an outdoor kid, and that's one reason it's hard for me to come up with books that were super important to me as a kid. The second reason is that I'm an extremely slow reader. Like I'm a very, very slow reader. And you kind of have an excuse for that once you become a writer, because you can say like, oh, I'm reading slowly because I'm reading and trying to take techniques from the book I'm reading and so on. But the fact is, I'm a very, very slow reader and writer for that matter. And the third kind of factor in all this is that I have a terrible memory. Like I just have a very, very bad memory. It's very spotty. I do know that I was into fantasy, like a lot of kids. My sort of entryway into books was books that felt like magical. And so The Neverending Story was a big book for me.
Okay.
There was a series of books called the Another Fine Myth series. They were by this author named Robert Asprin, Asprin, and they were all like titled after some sort of pun on the word myth.
Okay.
Like myth conceptions and that sort of thing. And they were just like pure sort of like comic in tone and very kind of like cartoonish, but just like absolute joys to read about dinosaurs and orcs and so on. And then, like Douglas Adams. Now that I think about it, I think the Hitchhiker's Guide books were really important to me when I was sort of toying around with the idea of reading, which again was like, I would have much rather been outside running around than doing any sort of reading.
Right. What's the meaning of life? It's like a numerical answer according to Douglas Adams.
Yeah, it's like, is it 40 something or 30 something? Okay. I forget, but yeah, yeah.
But there is an answer. There's a finite answer. All right.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So I tend to think of skateboarding, and the way you describe it so well is like it's, I guess, a lot of realism, where it's the videos from the old days, and it's like there's the performance part that you write about very well, but it's very realist. It's realism versus you were reading a lot of the fantasy. Did your reading taste change as you got older into more realistic nonfiction, like philosophical? I guess we're talking maybe more like high school and college now.
I think I know that I was very moved by reading Heart of Darkness in high school. Like I was very moved by, I think, the narrative structure of like hero goes into mysterious place and finds themselves changed. Right. And then, there's all sorts of discussion to be had about the Heart of Darkness. Yeah. And, as I'm sure, do you still teach that book? Is that still a book?
I don't. I'm not teaching it this year, but I teach Things Fall Apart.
Okay.
I've taught that for like 10 years, which is kind of like the antidote, if you will, to Heart of Darkness. But yeah.
But I mean, I think, and in my kind of understanding of it, like Heart of Darkness has always been a book about a racist enterprise, right? Like I think it was always pretty clear to me that the colonial project was always painted as a fairly evil enterprise. But in any case, like that was a book that really opened up for me the idea of like the sort of I don't know, I hesitate to like the sort of more philosophical side of fiction, the kind of questions of, I really remember thinking about the idea of the hero peering over the cliff into darkness and having a choice, like do I commit to this sort of life of unethical behavior, or am I going to go back into society? And I remember being, as like kind of a late teen, very into that idea, like into the idea that fiction could provide that sort of experience of wonder and confusion. And then, when I was an undergrad, I was a philosophy major who kind of backdoored my way into a double major in English. And that, that was my first real exposure to kind of contemporary literature. I remember a course taught by a woman named Kathleen Fitzpatrick. It was a science fiction course. And we read Neil Stephenson. We read, some of the sort of entry level postmodern theory stuff, Desert of the Real stuff. We read Neuromancer by William Gibson. Oh, wow. And I remember just thinking like, oh, this is like the coolest shit in the world. Like this is the best. And so, yeah, like I maintain that interest in, the sort of fantastical as a kind of series of thought experiments, you know, like what if this or what if
Okay.
that. And I, you know, I don't know, realism. I think, you know, I continue to struggle with realism as a kind of, as a genre. I don't know that the work that I've really been moved by has ever been the kind of thing you can classify as realism. Maybe like the detective novels, right? Like the hard-boiled stuff. But even
Okay.
that is so genre driven that it's hard to,
Right.
it's gritty, it's realistic, but it's certainly not, you know, realism.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, great call. There's a difference between realistic and realism. Yeah.
Mm.
Do you, I think of like, I don't know, like Henry Hill from Goodfellas or something like that. Is this the first time you've ever been compared to Henry Hill, or?
Yes. Yeah.
But you're a much better person, objectively, morally. But just the idea of like, especially how he's painted in the book, like as being like observing, being observant, even when you're in the moment, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder, like going back, I mean, that's what makes the Most Fun Thing such a great book. One of many reasons. Have you always felt like you've been the person kind of like standing back a little bit and like, you know, philosophizing, like?
I think that I have always felt, I've always felt that there is a risk of being that. I think, you know, the first writing that I really did, that really kind of blossomed, and this is before I was writing fiction or before I even thought of what I was doing as in any way a creative pursuit. The first writing that I did was kind of critical writing about music.
Okay.
And I recall like distinctly having a thought as I was writing an article. I was reviewing rap albums. There was a website called Hip Hop Infinity, and I was a reviewer for it. And I remember listening to, it was either Murs or the Juggernauts. And I remember listening to those albums and like actively thinking like, I am not hearing this album in the way I want to hear it because I'm thinking about having to write about it. And that's a kind of basic point. But I also remember like going to, now that I'm telling this story, going to a Social Distortion concert, like around that time, and really thinking like, I'm very glad I'm not writing about this, because if were I would, you know, my experience here would be radically different. I would have to be, you know, you have to be on, and you have to be diligent and noticing things and thinking about what they mean and so on. So I guess as if I've had that sort of proclivity or that temptation to be that sort of person, I've had an equal sort of force my whole life that's kind of been a warning, the sort of like, you know, the alarm bells start ringing, and I think like, whoa, make sure you're enjoying this.
Right. Oh, appreciate that. As you got into, you know, upper levels into college and such, was there a eureka moment or moments where, you know, specifically with writing, where it was like, I can do this, people read my stuff works, it's good, you know, I got a compliment from somebody I really respect? I wonder if there were any turning points like that.
You know, the first thing I ever wrote was a letter to the editor. We had so I went to a very small college called Pomona College in Los Angeles, and it's part of the Claremont schools. And like just by chance, our school paper was run by some incredibly smart and funny people. Among them, David Roth from, you know, who runs Defector now, and you know, long time kind of Deadspin, right? You know, like David Roth, who's you know, the best kind of current guy writing about Donald Trump. You know, he's an extremely funny and extremely smart writer. He was my and I remember kind of being around the school newspaper and kind of thinking like, oh, this is, I guess this is more like, oh, this is a cool thing to do. Like this is a good way to sort of thrive. You know, and like I guess it's been made kind of clear, like the sort of artistic background I grew up sort of admiring was largely based on like 1990s rap music, which more or less was based on like finding the most impressive ways to say like, hey, I'm dope, like I'm who you should be paying attention to, right? Like more or less like the battle raps of the 1990s were like, look how dope I am, let me perform, let me show off for you. And you know, that wasn't based on like ownership. It wasn't based on commodities. It wasn't yet the sort of bling that came up where it started being like how you show your worth as a rapper was look at my car, look at my rings, look at my chain, etc. Like this was still the time where like how you proved yourself as a rapper was like wordplay. And so I think I was really kind of schooled in the idea that like what writing should be is an active performance. It should be like, you know, you should try to be as impressive as you can. And I think in that school paper, I had a kind of venue to write things that were sort of silly, but like just get sort of my first taste of like showing off a little bit. And this is not honorable at all, right? This is not a good artistic origin story, but it really did for me come out of this sort of universe of like, if you have skills with language, you can entertain people and you can like, you can impress people, or you can have people kind of applaud you. You can leave an impression on them. And so like early stage, I think that was really kind of what my motivation was. Like, let's write something funny and as sharp as I can make it, and you know, do the performance, which of course led to all sorts of challenges later on as I sort of matured as a writer. But at the time, it really was this sort of like desire to kind of perform, like peacock a little with language.
Right. Well, you know, I started to write down some of the great lines from the book, and I kind of gave up because it's like, all right, it's gonna be too long of a list, right? But you know, so I mean, who were and are some of those writers for you? The ones that just, you know, gave you that last line that you're like, dang, or the one you had to read twice, but like for a good reason, you know? Who were some of those, you know, in those college years, or even, you know, even to this day, who thrill you?
I want to stress that I didn't really read for enjoyment until after college. Like it wasn't part of my life. But you know, once I did, it was that kind of, you know, you're in your young 20s and suddenly have all this time. At that point, it became kind of ravenous. Like I read all of Murakami, and I read all of David Foster Wallace, and I read all of, you know, not all of John Barth, because that's impossible, but I read a lot of John Barth. And I remember being, you know, I remember reading his novel Sabbatical and thinking like, oh, this is just wonderfully absurd. At some point I found Dennis Johnson, and I remember reading Angels and just thinking like, this is the best writing you could ever experience. I also at that time was sort of discovering Don DeLillo in his work. So, you know, it's really these sort of like late 20th century male writers that really roped me into the field. And, you know, because they were doing the sort of thing that spoke to me, right? I mean, at that stage, what I wanted to be was impressed by the sort of poetry and the lyricism and the syntax and the diction, etc. But I also wanted to read about characters who I sort of recognized, which, you know, I think is a totally healthy impulse when you're in your 20s, right? I mean, I think at a certain point as a reader, you start to understand that the real kind of deeper joys in reading and writing are being exposed to alternative perspectives and people who aren't like you or who don't come from a similar kind of world as you do. And so, you know, after that, I sort of branched out and started finding some of the writers who, you know, Marilyn Robinson. I was super into Joan Didion, Annie Dillard, you know, mostly nonfiction writers who just sort of started speaking to me in a different way. But, you know, when I think of like the sort of poetry of writing, like I really do return to Don DeLillo. And I think like you know, I'm wrapping up a course, a 15-week graduate level seminar on DeLillo right now. And it's like, I continue to believe that like pound for pound, he's the most sort of monumental writer that we have in this country in the last 50 years, 60 years.
Yeah. Man, you've been a professor for how long approximately, or how long exactly?
Well, I mean, I lucked out with my first kind of adjunct assignment. I got right out of my MFA. So that was 2005. So I've been in the classroom really for 17 years, which is absolutely wild to consider, that I've been doing it that long. But yeah, at the time I was a very young person, and I was very, I struggled a lot with trying to find that sort of, what is my level of authority here?
Oh yeah. Oh
You
yeah.
know, I'm 27 or whatever, and these kids are 20. Like,
Yeah.
what is,
Yeah.
who am I to them?
Yeah.
What about you? How long have you been a teacher?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was June of 2003, I was graduating, I was graduating college, and 2 months later
Mhm.
I'm a mister. I'm in charge of, some 17, 18 year olds. So yeah, I mean, for me, it was like, dress up, play the part a
Mhm.
little bit,
Mhm.
got to act, you got to act it out. You got to, fake it till you make it. And,
Yeah.
I was not a great teacher. I cared, and I, I had good ideas, but I made Chappelle Show references and stuff. I was cool.
Right. Right. You were the cool teacher. Do you still think you're the cool teacher?
No, no,
No.
unfortunately, no. I thought of myself as a young teacher for a while, but I'm 41 now. I'm almost 42.
Yeah.
I mean, Chappelle Show references. They don't get it. It's been a
No,
while
you
now.
should.
It's been
Yeah,
a while.
it's
You know.
different. Yeah.
Now they're like, you mean that horrible guy on Netflix? I'm like, yeah, that guy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask you about that with being a professor. I mean, you write in the book the most fun thing about having the cut on your wrist, while
Mm,
you're teaching class, the cut from skateboarding. and
yeah.
and I mean, is there a street cred there? Do they know about your book? Do they know you're a skater? Do they care?
You know, it's funny. Like,
And sorry, I'm saying they, like they're like, they.
yeah.
Yeah.
Some do.
Okay.
I have a graduating student right now. It's just a wonderful student who wrote me an email upon reading the book, which was a very moving letter that they wrote to me. But their sort of the sort of gist of their letter was like, you don't ever talk about this. Like, you don't bring this into the class. And I really don't, for the
Mhm.
most part. I just don't. I don't know why exactly that is. I don't know why, when when asked, about a wound on my body, why I sort of brush it off and don't dig into a little bit of how it happened. I don't hide that I am a skateboarder, right? There's certainly no like shame about it. But there I wrote this book that is largely about, an argument for the value of skateboarding as, among other things, potentially like pedagogy.
Hmm.
And yet I don't work it into my class. Like, I haven't, for the most part.
Yet, right?
Right. I mean, I do think there's a curriculum waiting to be made, that is based on skateboarding and based on, a wide array of kind of components of what it means to
Hmm.
engage in skateboard culture. But I really don't. I don't talk about it very much. I don't. If I mention anything, it's kind of in passing. I don't really leverage it into my practice as a teacher.
Hmm.
I and I'm not exactly sure why.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know. I guess because, part of it is, and you could probably sympathize with this, like a lot of what being a teacher is about, um, worried that you're underprepared, worried that you aren't a real authority,
Hmm.
essentially suffering the complex of feeling like a fraud for the most part. And so, I do a lot of over preparing, and, less now than I have in the past. But, when I look back at some of my class notes, I just have single space, like, 10 to 12 pages of preparation for a 2-hour class, which is absurd.
Right.
Right. And not a great way to teach a class, because it's over determined, and it doesn't leave a lot of air for the students to breathe, and so
Hmm.
on. So yeah, I think the reason I haven't ever is because I've never really felt comfortable using it. And maybe now that I have a book
Hmm.
about it and I can claim the authority, and I can, I've been sort of validated by this physical object of the book, maybe I'll be more willing to bring it in. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have no doubt you're the cool teacher, and I mean, not the cool teacher, the one who's like, yeah, no homework, like, that, not that one, but like the cool
Yeah.
teacher. And yeah, I mean, you're obviously over prepared, and that's better than the reverse, right?
Yeah,
Man.
it is. And I mean, I think the ideal thing, and I was speaking with my wife about this earlier, the sort of ideal thing for those of us who are drawn to over preparing is like to over prepare and then kind of like leave it and like trust that in the over preparation, you've given yourself enough ammo for whatever the class will be.
Right.
So
Great way to put
it's less determined, but it's still very prepared.
Right. No, it does make sense.
Yeah.
From what I've heard interviews with you, podcasts with you, and read about you, I mean, if you had to, would you call yourself a novelist? If you had to pick one, are you, I mean, you're more on the novelist side than the poet side for sure, right?
Yeah, certainly. And I'm certainly not a short story writer. I'm not a story writer. I mean, if I do identify as a novelist, which I probably do, it's for two reasons. And one of those is that like the thing I want to read when I have like, no matter what, like all things equal, if I could choose the thing to sit down with, the form I want to engage and the sort of reading experience I want to have is a novel's experience. And the other reason is that like, I'm not particularly gifted as a storyteller. I'm not particularly gifted with narrative.
I disagree. Okay,
well, yeah. Narrative. So like, you know, what a novel allows for is, you know, to the books I love are often the books that have a kind of bare minimum of a narrative impulse, right? Like, and novels can do that. And, you know, of course, there are short stories that are atmospheric and lyrical and that don't rely on a narrative structure. And of course, there's a whole mode of writing that is called poetry that has no sort of responsibility to the narrative impulse. But that said, like, you know, for me, the sort of real sweet spot is a novel that has a sort of narrative heartbeat, but it's not its primary interest.
That makes a lot of sense.
And that's also, you know, like what I have set out and what I aim to set out to write. Yeah. So yeah, novelist. Call me a novelist. Sure.
Tell me a little bit about the slide, like some of the seeds for the book and kind of what, you know, how you would kind of summarize it.
Sure. The slide is, and I have to be careful here because it's a book that I wrote as a very young person. Like I started that book as I was 22 years old. It was the year 2001. And I was living in Colorado, and I was working at a bookstore. It was the fall, and I read the corrections. And like I didn't know anything about Jonathan Franzen except that this was a very big book. You know, like I hadn't read 27 City. I hadn't read Strong Motion. I didn't know who he was or what he was about, but I did know that this book was largely about St. Louis, Missouri. And so, you know, what I gleaned from that was like, oh, this guy has like shit on my hometown. You know, like this guy is one of these sort of like shamed Midwesterners. Like he hates that he's a Midwesterner and so on. So I was like, well, I'm gonna try writing a book about St. Louis. And so in that way, it's very much a book drawn from my own experiences. You know, like were that a book I wrote now, I would certainly like make it auto fiction. But at the time, what it was what all first novels have been historically for hundreds of years, which is not auto fiction, but which is fiction that is, you know, largely drawn from the author's life and, you know,
thinly veiled fiction,
thinly fictionalized, right? Like you just make it more interesting. Sure. Essentially. And so, you know, I drove a water delivery van the summer after college. And it was an extremely eye-opening job because it exposed me to a city that I believed I knew in all of these new kind of ways. I was given a new sort of perspective on this very familiar place, and came to understand that my understanding of it was very, very limited. And, you know, I was also a confused young person who had spent, you know, the majority of my college life in a single romantic relationship and was really confused about what that meant now that college was over. And so it's a story about young love. It's a story about confusion. It's a story about professional sort of mysteries. Like what does one do with a liberal arts degree? And so in that sense, it's a fairly kind of typical post-college novel. It's also a pre-9/11 novel in some key ways.
Right.
And yeah, you know, I hope that it's got when I think about it most fondly now, it's that there's some weird stuff in there. Like it's a strange book. And that to me is my sort of like most proud thing about that book, is that it's actually pretty weird. But it's hard. It's very hard to look back on something. I wrote it. I took a very long time to write it, and I started it when I was very young. And so now I feel really distanced from it.
I think even by me saying market, it's going to go against, a lot of the skateboarding ethic or ethos. But I wonder, so the book is The Most Fun Thing, Dispatches from a Skateboard Life. Did you you talked a little bit like on some of the things I've heard about, like it being an untapped market. I mean, it is, right? Like skateboarding as philosophy, or, I mean, you'll explain it better than I do, but was there anything there about not market as in like, oh, the 18 to 24 demographic, but market as in like, this is something that is new and fresh and original? Or was it more just like, hey, I want to write something? And I know, it's in a lot of it is in essays that came as the years went on. Was it more like, started out very small, or did you have like a bigger plan in mind, if you will?
I mean, for me, I know that around 2009, 2010, so as my sort of first novel was coming out and I was kind of thinking about my next project, it seemed obvious to me that my second novel should be about skateboarding, right? Like here was something that I actually had a kind of authority on, right? If my first novel felt sort of typical and drawn from my own experiences, I guess my thought was, in my second novel, why not write about skateboarding, which no one has really written about in a way that I found satisfying, right? Like at the time, certainly no one had written a novel about skateboarding that really like got skateboarding right. Like there's an exceptionally important book called Skateboarding Space in the City by a guy named Ian Borden, an Englishman, that came out before that came out several years before that. But that was really driven by like architectural theory and sociology. And it was very, very theory driven and very academic. And I found it just like profoundly interesting. But it didn't do any of the work that, a novel can do. So I set out to write a novel. And like, it just didn't go anywhere. It just didn't work. And there are all sorts of reasons why the second novel is harder than the first novel. Their second book is harder than the first book. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. For me, the biggest reason was I really wanted it to be as different as possible from my first book. I sort of like bit off more than I can chew. And I tried to do a very ambitious sort of second novel. And it just wasn't working. And I knew it wasn't working, but I really wanted to believe that it was working and so on. But I was getting all these signals that like, hey, this isn't working from my editor, my agent, and so on. And so I started writing essays instead. I was like, well, I'm just going to write like theory then. I'm going to write criticism of skateboarding. I'm going to try to find a way to kind of get this stuff out of me. With the hopes that maybe by clearing the system a little bit, the novel would have time to breathe. So it started as those essays, and it was essays, and they didn't come very often. I only wrote one every like 8 months or so. But eventually after like 7 or 8 years, it was like, well, I've got enough of these now. Maybe I could turn it into a book. But I think the impulse that became the book was first and foremost an impulse to kind of perform a certain kind of criticism of skateboarding, to essentially submit skateboarding and skateboarding videos and skateboarding objects to the same kind of like close reading that one would do with a work of literature or work of cinema, and say like, okay, what do we have here? Like, what is this? And for the most part, that kind of question of what is this isn't one that skateboarding has really asked much, right? I mean, it hasn't been, if I can say things like skateboarding is this way or skateboarding is that way, like skateboarding hasn't been particularly curious about itself for a long time.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. So is it skateboarding hasn't been asked, or skateboarding hasn't asked itself, or is it it's more about the skateboarding has not asked itself. You think you're saying?
Yeah, skateboarding has certainly not asked itself. And again, I could get into a lot of the reasons why that is. And, a fair number of them occupy a big part of what the book is. And one of them has to do with, it has some very, very established founding mythologies. And those founding mythologies are so prominent that there wasn't really any need to ask questions, because it's like, well, it's all right there. We've got, there's Dogtown and the Z Boys. That's what skateboarding was born from, and that's the spirit of it, and that's what it is. When of course, like over 40 to 50 years, skateboarding became all these other things. And so, that's one reason. The other reason is there's not a lot of money in asking what doing self-examination. There's not a lot of profit in that. And skateboarding, for the vast majority of what it is an industry. It is a machinery to sell and market goods. And then beyond that, like, people didn't ask it of skateboarding, because mostly what skateboarding has been to the larger world is this kind of joke. It's this kind of punchline.
Right.
And so, but broader popular culture wasn't asking skateboarding, hey, what are you? It was instead like putting a stoner in the movie and giving him a skateboard and being like, ha ha, look at, Johnny Skateboard, who like doesn't go to class and is always stoned, like ha ha ha. So yeah, there hasn't been a lot of interest either from within skateboarding or from outside of skateboarding. And I should say that is changing magnificently, right? Like the last 10 years has seen a radical shift in the way that skateboarding examines itself and is much more rigorous and kind of doing a self evaluation. And it's become suddenly very interesting to academia, to broader popular culture, to the kind of world of athletics and so on. So that's changed a lot since 2010, which is more or less when I started writing this book.
It's in the best sense of the word. I mean, it's an unclassifiable book in so many ways, right? It's just, I mean, it's about, it's got it's got the philosophical, it's got the physical, it's got the architectural, it's got the ontological, is that the word, right? I mean, it's syntax and language itself, and but it's it's a very honest book. I mean, it's got stuff about marriage and about relationships. How hard was that to be? I mean, it's one thing to say to do it about like your friend from 30 years ago, but like people that I mean, your wife, and like who's also a great writer herself. Like what, how is that to be not extremely open, not right? I mean, it's not brutally open or brutally, brutally honest, whatever. But, sorry, long story short, what was it like to be open?
Yeah. I mean, what it's not is like, spectacular or voyeuristic.
No, not at all.
Like it's not,
it's not TMZ.
Yeah, it's not that. I mean, I guess to kind of the first point you raised there, like the reason the book is sort of all over the place, which incidentally makes it a very hard book for my publishers to sell, right?
I can see that.
Lacking a kind of direct comp, you end up like kind of reaching and trying to compartmentalize, because that's what publishing has to do. The reason it's all over the place is because, frankly, like skateboarding itself is a very strange, amorphous thing. And so it seemed to me that for a work of literature to do any sort of justice to the thing at the core of this, which is skateboarding, the book itself had to take all these different angles to kind of get at it. And, skateboarding permeates, skateboarding is among the many things it is. It's a sort of like, it sort of finds its way in, it kind of sneaks its way into spaces. And so, I could find myself writing about something that isn't skateboarding at all. And then suddenly here I am thinking about skateboarding, or, oh, that reminds me of this thing or whatever. And so on that front, there was very little, like, there was no deliberation to try to make the book varied. It's just that in writing about skateboarding, I went a lot of directions. And one of those directions was into my marriage. And the fact is that the sort of three most rewarding and also the three most difficult things in my life are skateboarding, writing, and being a loving partner. And so, in that sense, they sort of triangulated kind of what this book is. and you know, the basic kind of point here is that as a skateboarder, it informs all of this. It informs my writing, or it didn't inform my writing enough. It informs my sense of being a husband and my sense of what a sort of difficult relationship requires and what the rewards of that are. So yeah, I mean, it seemed like if I was going to write about my marriage at all, I had better do it in a way that was as kind of naked as possible. And so yeah, I should also stress that my wife is a poet, as you alluded to, and my wife has written some exceptionally beautiful poems about our life and our relationship and what we've been through. And so I think we both have a kind of mutual trust and respect that the other person is going to address our marriage, our shared world, in a way that the other will appreciate and understand.
Yeah, you had such a light touch with it, where it's clear the love, but it's self-examination, it's all the above. And like they're saying on the I'm a Writer But, which is a great with Lindsay and Alex, which was a great episode with you. All their episodes are great, but everyone goes through it. Why aren't we talking about and
yeah and I think I think I don't know. I would love to figure out if it's true, but I mean, certainly there are divorce stories, and there are stories about failed marriages, and I would guess that probably we're a lot better in the year 2021 than we were in the year 2000 in like addressing the reality of failed marriages, right? I mean, you can't socially have a failure rate of over 50% without addressing it at some point, right? Like this is it. This is the world we've created. So yeah, I mean, I think to try to get in there, and a lot of this was also timing. We were going through our kind of darkest moments as this book was kind of turning into, it stopped being a collection of essays and turned into a book. And so, part of it was just quite literally, this is what I was living through at the time. We were very nearly separated. We essentially made the decision to separate. And then, there was a global pandemic. And we found ourselves kind of reevaluating who we are and what we want and so on.
Well, I appreciate the honesty, even just talking with me now about that, everything. And in the book, I mean, unclassifiable again in the best possible way. You talk about skateboarding is basically like skateboarding is everything and is nothing.
Yeah.
And you say it much more, succinctly. Just you do a better job with it. I don't know about succinctly, but
yeah.
But just the idea of like, what is skateboarding even? Are you, if I'm watching it, if I'm, sitting on the stairs while the others are, running the stairs, like, and just that idea. And so that makes sense with the book, where the book wouldn't be at its best if it were just a straight line narrative, right?
Yeah.
Like skating. Tell us a little bit about skating, is just like what skateboarding even is, or if that matters.
So yeah, I mean, I the way that I think about skateboarding now is as a sort of embodied and variously spiritual practice, right? Like I mean, really, it's its closest kind of comparisons are yoga, dance. I think Tai Chi actually has a whole lot in common with skateboarding. The difference being that one who skateboards is also, in addition to doing all of the sort of these embodied practices and physical kind of body memory, kind of establishing body memory, muscle memory, training one's body to achieve like certain set kind of goals. Like, I would like to achieve this trick, I'm going to work toward it, and so on. In addition to all of that stuff, in addition to whatever sort of spiritual lessons it might teach us about failure and sort of fortitude and all of these things, it seems to me that the one of the most important realities of what it means to skateboard is to develop a way of looking at the world that essentially is like a kind of like, I don't know, it's like a kind of piracy, or like being a bounty hunter, like you move through the world, and all of these shapes that we take for granted as being the shape of stairways or the shape of where a sidewalk meets a lawn before the street begins. Like all of these sort of totally incidental, negligible realities of our kind of built environment for the skateboarder are absolute like playgrounds. And you start to see the world differently. And so, you know, where that goes for me is like, well, if we're going to see the world differently in that way, like, couldn't we train ourselves to see the world in all of these other ways and so on. But I guess, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, the sort of most, I think, meaningful kind of pull quote or pull sort of quality of what skateboarding is that it is a perceptual practice. Like it is quite literally a way of being in and seeing and engaging the world.
Wow, thank you. My you I think one of the chapters is actually called First. And what a great phrase. You described yourself in first time skateboarding as, quote, illegally skinny. That's some good stuff right there, man. My first time I was like 3, and my neighbor Jesus took me out there. He was probably, I don't know, 12, 13. And I got on and I fell and I got hurt, and that literally was it.
Yeah.
Was it?
Well, you were 3. You were.
I was 3. You used the term possibly apocryphal, which is a great phrase. I've told myself that story. Obviously, you know, probably my parents told me it first.
Yeah.
I think it's true, but was it love at first sight for you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I know that I really wanted a real skateboard. You know, I mean, there was a period in the 1980s where, you know, again, I was in suburban St. Louis. I had a sister who's 5 years older than me. And so like our garage had the sort of typical garage things, you know, there were like, there were basketballs and there were baseballs and gloves, and there was probably like a hockey stick and a puck and all this stuff. And so like somewhere in there in the mix was like a, you know, a shitty plastic skateboard. And I remember lobbying hard for my parents to like upgrade me to a real skateboard. And I know that once I did that, like I was pretty committed to it, not least of all because, you know, we were not a family of great means. And I knew that my parents had bought it for me. And so I was like, well, I better use this. But I had a buddy up the street who was also named Kyle. In the book, he's other Kyle. He was into it too. And, you know, like so much of skateboarding at that time was, do you have someone nearby who you will do it with? And that's it. Because, you know, these are totally obvious things, but I feel the need to say them. They're like, there was no internet. There was no way to find other skaters. There were no skate parks. You know, this was late 1980s. And like, there was a kind of boom in the 80s for like fluorescent colors and half pipe skateboarding. And, you know, of course, Michael J. Fox and Back to the Future, like opened up a whole lot of kind of marketplaces, but like, for the most part, people would buy a skateboard and then just kind of stop. It really was a kind of fad. And so if you didn't have a crew, like if you didn't have neighbors or you didn't have people nearby who were doing it, I would have stopped. So I'm super grateful to other Kyle for, you know, kind of bridging the lives between, you know, totally isolated neighborhood stuff and then getting into like elementary school and junior high and really finding a crew to do it with.
But I mean, how do you know you're not the other Kyle? You know?
Yeah, well, I am definitely the other Kyle. I mean, certainly in some key ways, I am the most minor Kyle. He is far more Kyle than I am in some key ways.
You were saying that the first skate park in your area wasn't until the late 90s then.
Yeah. Man. Yeah. I mean, St. Louis, Missouri. I mean, within the city of St. Louis, there remains no public skate park.
Wow.
Yeah, in the year 2021, the city of St. Louis does not have a public skateboard.
This is not some small town, man.
No, it's terrible. It's a travesty. At the time, there were parks that were kind of like, you know, gatherings of like wooden ramps that would be in an old hockey rink. In the summer, a skate shop nearby would like put a bunch of ramps in there and so on. But it certainly wasn't a place where parents would drop off their kids or sit there and like read the newspaper while their kids rode a skateboard. It just wasn't that. I didn't really have a public skate park until one was built in Columbia, Missouri, which is, it's about 90 miles away from St. Louis.
Wow.
And that wasn't until really like 97, 98. Yeah.
So obviously fun is, I mean, you play with the term fun, what it means, what it is, even the oh gosh, what's the easy word I can't think of right now? What do you call it? The history of a word, the history
Oh,
of
the etymology.
the etymology even, right?
Yeah.
And a lot about David Foster Wallace, who's from, my geography's not great, but downstate Illinois, I guguess you'd say, right?
Yeah.
Close to where you grew up. Obviously you're in Chicago now. Excuse me. But I see so many cool parallels in your work. Not as many footnotes for sure, but some. The vocabulary, the way that you seem to love language, as I do, as just the minutia of words, like I said, the syntax. It's hard to be funny on the page. I say that as an amateur, and you're funny. You have that right sense of humor there, keen eye for detail, infinite jest, which I say with no sense of pride. I've not read. I know the story, I know a lot about it, but a lot of it, right, is about fun and entertainment. He wasn't some guy who just read all day. He watched TV and he was into pop culture, right? And it's just this idea of fun and too much, how much is too much, and what that can do to you and all of that. You got to meet the guy.
I did, yeah. So I was graduating Pomona during the year, basically, that the search committee was hiring him, and I was an English major. Again, as I said, I kind of backdoored my way into an English major. I was not a fiction writer at the time. I hadn't written any. Like I said, I hadn't really found an impulse to write, but I did know that this guy was a very big deal, and I had read a couple of his stories. And so when he came for his campus visit, I managed to kind of weasel my way into the fiction workshop that he led, and then go from there to the kind of graduate reading, or the sort of the reading he gave, the public reading that he gave. And along the way, like, I kind of, by jostling, I like ended up next to him, going to the dining hall and walking around with him. And it turned out we had several things in common. Like we were both from Ithaca, both born in Ithaca, New York.
Oh, wow.
Both of us were philosophy and English double majors. We were from the Midwest, grew up in the Midwest. He was from Bloomington, Normal.
Yes, Bloomington. Right.
And so, yeah, like, we ended up having enough in common that we kind of hit it off, and had again, my memory is like criminally bad about the night, but I remember him just being a very, like, really kind, charming, and very, very nervous guy. Like, he was super nervous, and rightfully so. Like, it's a great gig that he got offered there. It was, it's automatic tenure and 6-figure salary, and like one class every year, I think he taught. So it was like, it's a pretty cherry job. So yeah, it was meaningful to me. And, that was before really I had found his work. But yeah, like I said, like, my interest in fun certainly would not be what it is had I not spent as much time as I spent reading David Foster Wallace and reading, the cruise ship essay, a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again. Infinite Jest and its treatment of fun and games, and addiction as being the sort of place where fun turns into something far more nefarious.
Right.
Dependency. So yeah, I mean, I am extremely grateful for the role his work played in kind of my sort of formative years, is like learning to ask the questions that I want to ask as a writer.
Couple of things there. One of the pieces that I just enjoy so much, especially for the ending, is the piece he wrote about Bloomington right after 9/11. Are you familiar with that one? The view from
the view from Miss
so-and-so, right? Miss Thompson sounds right.
Yeah.
And just the ending there, and about, oh man, but just kind of that slice of life, like Midwest, but yeah, just the distinction he draws between, who the terrorists supposedly were going after, and versus these women. And then also, you talk about obviously a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again. I want to do a podcast just on that piece. I mean, there's just so much going on there. I mean, so incredible. And like I said, like, to be funny on the page. Like, how do you do that? And he did that, but it was
He
also
did
obviously
that.
very depressing, very dark,
Right.
all the
Right.
above.
Right. And I mean, again, like speaking to where this conversation kind of started, I mean, he was a writer. He was a writer in a way that I don't think that I'm a writer, which is to say, like, I know necessarily that the only way that I can stay healthy as being a writer is to have a whole lot of things in my life that are not right.
Yes.
And so, the other thing for me is that, like, skateboarding has been this sort of counterbalance to this sort of difficulties of what writing asks of a person. I think, though, like that the 9/11 essay, the view from, I'm going to say Mrs. Thompson's,
I think you're right.
I hope I am. This is very embarrassing for a Wallace scholar. But in any case, the thing that I really remember from that essay was the kind of sense of fellowship and communion.
Right.
And I guess my favorite Wallace is the Wallace who is open to speaking of fellowship and speaking of his kind of experiences with, if not church, then gatherings that sure feel a whole lot like church. And I think for me, one of the things that has always been so mysterious about skateboarding is the sort of balance between the individual performance and the absolute necessity of community that skateboarding gives us. And again, if writing is this solitary event or this solitary practice, what skateboarding gives you is this sort of alternative. And I end up more or less arguing in that book that skateboarding alone isn't actually skateboarding, like that community is actually necessary to be doing the thing that we call skateboarding.
Right. So you are correct. It is Miss Thompson's.
Oh, good.
The last line. Now he's talking about the horror with a capital H, which of course is, the planes. Yeah. I'm trying to explain the way part of the horror, capital H, was knowing that whatever America the men in those planes hated so much was far more my own, mine and F's. This is the name, and poor old loathsome Dwayne's than those ladies.
Yeah.
Man. Very understated, but wow, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's sort of trite to say at this point, but one of the things that I think a lot of us people who are fans of Wallace, and there are obviously all sorts of ways to be a bad fan, right? Like of anything, right? That to be blind to the realities of your object's kind of uglier side. And like we know now, years removed from Wallace's death, there were some deeply problematic parts of who he is.
Never meet your heroes, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, or never have your heroes be around long enough to find out everything about them, or whatever. I mean, the thing though, like when I teach Wallace, the last time I taught in my class on Infinite Jest, where our textbook is Infinite Jest, and that's it. Read Infinite Jest. I mean, the thing that I found was that by foregrounding all of that stuff, all of the problem, all of the treatment of women, the hypermasculinity of the writing, the really, really awkward treatment of race in that novel.
Right.
Like when you foreground that stuff, it has a real wonderful way of enriching the conversation, right? Like one doesn't want to discuss Wallace without his ugly sides, and I don't think one wants to discuss those books at this point. I think it's impossible to discuss those books without discussing, like, here's the person who wrote them, here's when he wrote them, here's how we discuss them now. Like all of those kind of meta lessons are so important.
Right.
I don't know how we got onto that, but it does seem to me that it's a good kind of example of if the questions are there, if the work itself is asking interesting questions, there is always something to rescue from the work.
Well, a heck of a line from you. I mean, it was I got a chill from the chill you got. I mean, obviously a lot of it is the fact that he died by suicide, etc., and just like you talk about the nervousness. But your line, this was back at Pomona, you wrote, quote, knowing knowing with full certainty that I was not equipped to be the way he was.
Yeah.
And that word equipped, I mean, it can mean so much there, right? Like
Yeah.
you said, I mean, thank goodness you and I mean, he didn't have those other things. He was, I don't know what it would be like to be that brilliant. You tell me. I don't know. I haven't been
No,
there.
no, I can't.
You
I mean,
know?
what I can tell you is that, like, I do believe that we are all equipped in some ways, and there are all sorts of ways to frame that
Mhm.
as God's gifts or your like genetic proclivities or whatever. But I do also believe that there are always going to be real costs for the ones that you
Yes.
have.
Yes.
Um,
No
and
doubt.
a lot of what I've kind of been working on as a writer, or as a person who tries to be a writer every day, is coming to terms with the things I don't have, right? Like, here are the limitations. And so when I say to you, like, I'm not particularly gifted with narrative, like that is true. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to sit down and try to write a story. It just means that the way I will come at a story will not be the same as, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been around someone who is like an exceptionally good storyteller. Like, to me, it's like being around a ninja. Like, I've sat at a table with the poet Danny Kalachi, and
Okay.
and he's not this isn't a story writer. He's a poet. He has a new book coming out soon, I believe. I wish I could tell you the name of it. But he sits there and he tells this story, and I've heard him tell it twice now. And both times, like, the atomic core of the story has been the same character, same event, same things happening. It has to do with going to the poet Jim Galvin's like farm and killing a bunch of like barn mice. And it's like, so the story is like about exterminating these little creatures. But the way he's told the story has been so similar each time, with enough key differences, that I have literally sat there and like marveled at his ability to just tell a story. It's incredible. And I do not have it. I do not have that skill. So it's like, like, back to Wallace and equipment, like, Fanzine is always going on about how like Wallace couldn't appreciate bird watching. And I think Franzine's a dick about that. But I also think there's something true in the fact that, like, we have different equipment. And so I've really tried to cultivate the part of me that isn't rooted in the practice of writing, which is, thank God, largely about skateboarding.
Well, my limited knowledge of the writing community and the writing life is that, there's a lot of like, oh man, like this is rough. And, oh, I got to put the butt in the chair. And, oh man, there's all these memes about, how to be a better writer. And the next one is like, that
Right.
type of thing, right? There's, a lot of talking about how writing sucks. You write about, writing is fun at times, right? A lot of times. Remind me, please, of the name of that out there profane writer who you write about in the book.
Oh, Dave Carney.
Correct. Who, there was a little bit of disappointment when you talked about him later, kind of like killing that story, or helping to, I guess. But just that he had no rules really, and just had fun. And that bleeds into the reader, right? The reader's just like, this looks like this is fun. So there's, Wallace, you in the book as well, a lot of like darkness in relation to light. Sometimes I think it's a couple times it's literal. But like, of course, there's the pandemic, which is, can't even explain how dark it's been. But there's also time for you to find release, and you go skate, and there's, you and your wife have great times, and you dance and you laugh. And a lot about, obviously, with age, when you're a kid, the world is fresh and new, and there's so many possibilities. And so that kind of goes into the idea of like, aging. I mean, you're still quite young.
Thank you.
But yeah, so I guess I just a little bit about writing is fun. Can you tell that a lot from when you read? Can you be like, man, this is fun for the person? Or is that,
I mean, I think there are writers who I would say like, oh, it's obvious this guy is having fun, or this person is having fun. I think when I read Anne Carson, for example, I feel like she is always having fun. I feel like I'm friends with the Danish author Dorte Norse, and I feel like Dorte, when she is working in her short stories, is having a good time. My friend Christian Tabordo who's writes a bunch of weird small press books and is one of my favorite writers. He has a book out now that just came out called The Apology. And it's clear that he's having fun as he's writing that. I think for me, what it is that I erred for a very long time on the side of seriousness. And what I've learned is that I will not lose that seriousness, no matter like how wacky and off the cuff I think I'm being. Is actually, I still am remaining like very, very serious with a little bit of a tinge of humor. And so like, really, really, truly for me, when I speak about writing being fun, like I'm speaking, in terms of ambition. Like I need it to be, it has to be, because it's taken me to the darkest places I've ever been. And I can't have that. Like, it's either that I write in a different way or I stop writing. And I think a lot of what this kind of project with centering skateboarding and really putting skateboarding under a microscope allowed me to do was see that, in fact, I have all of these practices and I have all of these ways to find balance, and I have all of these ways to not be bothered by the sort of envy that drives my thinking as a writer and as a person working in publishing. I have all of these ways that I'm not competitive, that I actually feel total support for people who are more successful than me. Like, I know that I am capable of those things. And so a lot of what I mean when I say like writing for fun is really just code to mean like, stop being so terrible about it. Like, tap into the other part of you. And I think, my hope is that I've sort of figured that out. I think, at least for a time. I don't believe it's permanent. I'm not thinking that I've like come out of this and I've recovered from my bad habits of being a writer. I certainly think they're still there, but I do believe that I have found a way to engage with the practice of writing in such a way that it won't threaten my livelihood. And thank God, because like you talk to a lot of writers, and the fact is that it's hard. It's super hard. But I also don't think that we need to like center that difficulty for a kind of woe is me fest. I don't know that gets us anywhere.
Right. I think Tony Soprano was saying that remember when is some of the lowest form of conversation or something like that. How do we avoid, so skateboarding in particular, how do you talk about the early days, the purity? You also talk about how a lot of the myth was not necessarily as positive or as pure as thought to be. How do we, because I speak as this too, like somebody who played basketball and was fairly good, and as you get older, you're like the guy who doesn't get picked, or you don't want to be the one who holds everyone back. This idea of like both as you as a skateboarder, like performing, and also kind of looking back at like the early days, because even as from the outside, and from your book, I clearly know that skateboarding is so different. And it's way more commercialized, right? But how do we avoid becoming, or does it matter if we do or not? How do we avoid becoming the one who's like, in my day we had, iced tea and we had MERS in the little later days. Now you guys got all the Lils and you got the do you know what I mean?
Right.
How do we keep the freshness and the purity of the past without like poo-pooing the present day?
I think, that is a massive question. I think it starts with it starts with changing the pronoun, right? Like, I think the way to ask that question is like, how do I, because like skateboard, as I said earlier, like the skateboarding industry has a real interest in selling nostalgia, and so it will always be peddling nostalgia.
Sure.
Because as long as there are 40-year-old former skaters, there are going to be nostalgic items that the industry is trying to sell them. And I think the same goes for like all forms of entertainment, right? Like what's a good example? Every reboot of every movie from the 80s is like, do we need a Top Gun sequel? No, we don't. Are there going to be new Top Gun fans? I don't know. but like, I think the much better, or maybe the much more effective way to approach that is like, how do I, and with skateboarding, the answer is that luckily the stuff that's going on now is frankly more interesting. It is like, I can sit here and say, and I don't think it requires like some sort of great mental gymnastics to say this, like, I think skateboarding in the middle 1990s was as cool as it will ever be. It is the coolest shit that has ever happened. I really truly believe that.
Yeah.
But I also think that skateboarding in 2021 is as interesting as it has ever been, and that it's as varied and as rich and as multivalent as skateboarding has ever been. I mean, the thing about, the big lie of nostalgia is thinking that it's not just thinking that the thing you love is better than it was. It's thinking that it's bigger and broader than it was. Probably what it is that like the thing you love and saw as the whole world was a tiny little thing.
Sure.
And like, there are people alive today who will sit down and argue with you with a straight face that like skateboarding would be better if it were smaller, if there were less people doing it. Sorry, excuse me.
No problem.
I have no water. I only have wine here.
No, I was wondering. And I know you're in the Midwest, and I want to respect your time. So, maybe 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm having a great talk.
I know these things go long. They tend to go
time.
long. But I mean, I guess the thing I want to say is that there are people who will say to you that skateboarding should be smaller, and that like it's blown up and it's not whatever anymore. And I think there are valid points in that. Like, skateboarding isn't as cool as it used to be, and that's because part of what being cool is being like an outcast and doing a thing,
being scared,
despite despite it being frowned on socially and so on. That's not what skateboarding is anymore. That has nothing to do with the sort of value and the substance of what skateboarding is now. And so I don't know, like, I think so like rap's a good analog here. Like, I do believe that the mid 90s made the kind of coolest rap music, but I also know that you start listening to that stuff and the samples get pretty repetitive, and you hear so many like DJ Premier, like Gangstar scratch choruses, and you start to wonder like, boy, could these songs go any other direction? And like, I mean, I guess that's really the answer, is that you start to appreciate what's around the thing itself. And like, for skateboarding, that means all of the people who are doing it now are coming at it from totally different angles. And the fact that like, there are high schools teaching skateboarding, like, that's weird. Like, that's very strange for a person who grew up skating in the 80s and the 90s, got, even more the 70s. But that doesn't make it in any way like bad. It just means, it's what it is. I don't know. I guess the basic answer is that there is beauty to be found if you just open your eyes a little bit and see it.
I feel like I mean, from the outsider view, I feel like I did, growing up myself, did see a very white skateboarding culture.
Yeah.
When I began teaching, a lot of my students, the places where I were, I did see a very brown and black, very, many, non-white, in much more inclusive culture. So it's really cool to see that. You write about some of the ugliness with is it Jesse?
Jesse, yeah.
Yeah. And man, you talk about hip hop. That letter that you wrote, I guess, to the editor was like hit him up. Was like, F this person, F that person. And not to joke about it, I mean, there were some pretty horrific comments he made, and you were right on. And then you had that follow-up essay, it kind of sounded like it had a happy ending, if you will. Were you able to get it out there? And, then you talked about how you wrote the article, and it got you a lot of, thank you for that and good feedback. And then, the article was kind of killed. I guess just a long way of getting at like, I don't know if it's a Venn diagram or like two lines going opposite ways. I think of like, okay, hip hop, let's say culture versus skateboarding, but then they come together with like sick and dope and right. And kind of like the outlaw, if you will. How much, I guess, appropriation is there still? Do you feel like it is a much more inclusive place? I mean, I don't know the history of, is it Paul Anderson? Bruce, the one who came out as gay.
Oh, Brian Anderson.
I'm talking about the movie director, I think. But I mean, you know, it's such a sad story in so many ways. Like you described it so well about the burden that we can only imagine he had to carry.
Right. Right.
But also that he's out there with his message, you know. But I guess
Yeah.
just like, I guess about the inclusivity of skating
Yeah.
today.
I mean, yeah, I will tell you this. Like I had a phone call this morning, the guy named Chandler Burton, who put out a video probably about a month ago called Bottom Feeder. And it's as far as I can tell, it's the first skate video to merge skate culture and drag culture.
Wow.
Chandler has a character named Titus, who is his drag persona. And it was made by a guy named Matt King, who's a guy from the suburbs of Chicago who now lives in LA, who makes skate videos that are like, they draw a lot from horror films, and they're very like, they're very aggressive, kind of confrontational. And so he made this video, and it's a skate video that like absolutely could not have existed 5 years ago in the world of skateboarding. Like, to go even any year past 5, it just becomes like a joke that this thing could possibly exist. And that, again, doesn't mean that there weren't queer people in skateboarding,
Of course.
but it means that the culture did not center. I mean, this video premiered on Thrasher magazine, and it, you know, is greenlit and kind of stamped with the approval of Thrasher magazine. So yeah, I mean, in terms of inclusivity, like what skateboarding has really become in the last 10, I'm going to say 10 years. And of course that's a really, really blunt kind of timeline to say, but like the last 10 years really have shown that the infrastructure of skateboarding, the kind of system that skateboarding actually is inclusive and is actually open to all sorts of people. It's just that for years, certain people have had control over the messaging of it, and have had control over telling kids what is cool and what is bad, and how we should speak to each other. And, you know, like when I grew up using the language I use, like that requires some change on my part to realize like, oh, Jesus, like, you don't speak this way. This is dehumanizing. This is terrible. This is violence. So it, to me, is extremely promising that skateboarding has come the distance it's come in the last 10 years. Yeah. Given how much sort of inertia there was for, you know, that created difficulty in affecting that change. You know, skateboarding values were very rooted and very kind of clear cut for a long time. And now, you know, we sort of are living in this joyful place where like anyone can do it. Anyone can do it however they want. People are allowed to say like, I think that's stupid. I think what you're doing is dumb. I think what this person's doing is cool. And that there's no one voice set like who's in charge of making that sort of value judgment. And so there are all these other voices saying, well, I think you're wrong. I think actually this thing you think is dumb is super cool. And that thing that you think is cool, I think is really stupid. So that's it. And that's kind of, you know, I don't know if that's a particular version of utopia where people are able to just do what they want and talk as much shit about themselves as they want. And it kind of ends up equalizing itself. So I don't know. I mean, you know, your point about hip hop is an important one. Skateboarding through the 1990s essentially took whatever it could from hip hop culture, from Black culture. What we saw in the kind of the last 10 years was some of the like biggest names in hip hop and Black culture taking from skateboarding. And so there is this sort of, you know, reciprocation between hip hop culture and, you know, with punk culture and, you know, also, you know, motorcycle culture. Like these are cultures that overlap with skate culture, and they have this kind of symbiotic relationship.
One of my heroes in life is Pharrell, right? Skateboard P. Man. So I thought we could finish with just, you know, again, there's so much about relationships and introspection and so many good lines. And one of the parts is about, you know, what will happen when you're not able to skate anymore?
Yeah.
For you, for your marriage, for, you know, all the other implications.
Yeah.
I mean, is there like a precedent? I mean, are there, you know, are you out there, are you seeing 75-year-olds out there? Are you, you know, are you gonna like, hey, you know, it's kind of like, I can still do, but I want to be good at it. So I'm not gonna do it when I'm 70. I'm gonna quit when I'm 65. Like, is there an end date, or are you gonna see how it goes? Like, how does how does that work?
I mean, I know that what I'm doing right now, I'm 43. I was born in 1978. So what I'm doing right now is like extremely satisfying. I'm learning like I've learned new tricks this year that I've wanted to do
Nice.
my whole life. I also am being much more deliberate in listening to my body, right? I mean, as much as that phrase is, sort of, you got to put quotes around it, but I am, I am listening to my body. And if I am out skating and I can tell that I'm not having a good day, I'll just sit down and I'll be fine with it. I think that I will always stand on a skateboard. As long as I can stand, I will enjoy standing on a skateboard, right? Just the physical sensation of being on the board and riding over whatever the texture of the ground is will give me some joy. It will be frustrating because I can't do what I would want to do. But my sense is now at age 43 is that actually, like, there's a real kind of shifting goalposts, but in the good way,
Okay.
where like, actually I'm having as much fun on a skateboard as probably I've ever had in my life. And
Nice.
despite or because of the limitations I have.
Sure.
There's a 88-year-old man in Japan who in the last like 3 years has learned how to ride a skateboard. And it's beautiful, right? It's
Nice.
just, it's absolutely beautiful. So yeah, I mean, Tony Hawk is in his 50s or whatever. He continues to just abuse his body in some key ways. But you learn to listen to it. You learn to fall differently. And every now and then you have the sort of injury that makes you wonder if you should keep doing it. I have been very fortunate to not tear a meniscus and not do anything that requires surgery. And so I haven't really faced that sort of situation. I also should say that I was never someone who threw myself off of sets of 10 to 15 stairs. Like that was never my thing. And so it's different, I think, for those guys. I got to, my buddy Ryan Lay, who I do the podcast with, to Vent City with, he's a big stair guy. He jumps off big sets of stairs. And the question is like, how do you transition out of that? Because that's what he wants to do. That's fun. I don't know.
No, to be clear, you've got many, many years left, but thinking
Thank
way down the line,
Yeah.
line.
Yep.
I'll just end with some great lines just about being a human, without being too cheesy, but you write about like the idea of knowing someone, and you write something about how like our nows, our nows are different than others, right? Just the way that we see things, the way that we see the world, and just the idea of truly knowing someone. Quote, like, we watch each other and try to understand, describing citizens of different worlds. And I want to say it's maybe the first chapter is pretty dang towards the beginning, one of those where you read it and you're like, yep. The part that you wrote about the gifting quandary, if you will, where you had a gift that you wanted and you kind of said, hey, kind of elbowed your wife and said, hey, can you buy it for me? Like, that rang so true with me, right? Just the little ins and outs of relationships, of marriage, that I thought just nailed it. So are you nudging her for anything this Christmas that you basically could buy yourself? But like,
we have our gift giving this year is particularly it lacks romance. We're very clear about here is the thing I want.
nice.
And it remains to be seen if we'll also still do the thing where we get like little cute things and try to surprise our way into that. But no, I mean, I think the sort of, I think gift is one of those wonderful, and Derrida has written about the gift a whole lot. Like there's a lot of theorizing of the gift. Religious studies gets into the gift a whole lot. I think on a practical level for me, the notion of gifting is a really interesting kind of way to wrench open some of our assumptions. And one of the things the slide did was really try to like put the notion of love under the microscope. And again, I was a young man, but I do think the gift here is a useful kind of approach to what skateboarding is, because in a certain sense it is the thing that asks so much out of us and our body. But, you know, at the end of the day, like, as I say in the last chapter of the book, like what I think mostly what skateboarding is like this way to feel perpetually grateful. Like, um, and so there's that other kind of flip side of what a gift is, which is that to be on the receiving end and to feel the joys of gratitude and not have that gratitude be poisoned by like, oh, now I have to, you know, I owe you this or
Right.
so on. The sort of like the pure gift with giver and receiver, and giver feeling as kind of empowered by it as the receiver does.
I have some students. I don't know if it would be the oh boy, I'm forgetting the term, the like the Pashtun peoples of like of South Asia, of Pakistan. There's a code they live by. It's Pashtunwali, something to that effect. And it's the idea of like giving gifts on your own birthday, even. Like you
Yeah.
give the gift. It's your birthday and you give the gift. And that took me aback. Like, wow, what an incredible idea.
Yeah.
Right? What an
Yeah.
incredible idea.
Yeah.
What an incredible book for the pandemic. I mean, you write about, you know, times during the pandemic. You know, we're all looking for time to get outside, especially you write about towards the beginning of it when everyone was locked down. Just the idea of freedom and like, you know, being able to do what you love. You talk about gratitude. It's a book that I'm already thinking of like, all right, my friend here, he's gonna like it. My friend here, he's gonna like it. I'm neutral probably towards skateboarding. I have nothing negative to say, and
Yeah.
just love the book.
Thank
Just
you.
learned so much about it. I'm Wikipediaing, looking up Nigel Houston and these names, and I'm gonna go back and watch such and such movie and video and so, you know, thanks so much for this book. It came together over the years in such a perfect way. I'm sure it was not as easy as it reads. I'm sure it was not as smooth as it reads, you know, to put it all together like that. But congrats on the book.
Thank you.
I wish you great luck with everything you have in the future, and maybe we can meet in real life one of the days and talk Wallace and skateboarding and hip hop and all that good stuff.
I would love it. Peter, thank you very much, man. It's been a joy. I
Hey,
appreciate it.
been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Yep.